In 1671, a scholar in Rome published the first European book devoted entirely to coffee, and inside it he repeated the story he could not prove, that the drink had been discovered by an Ethiopian goat herder watching his animals dance. By the time that book appeared, men in Mecca had already been beaten in the streets for drinking it. An Ottoman sultan had made it punishable by death. A Sufi mystic had smuggled it out of Arabia hidden in his beard, and entire fortunes were being staked on the trade in roasted beans. A drink you can buy today for under $2 was once dangerous enough to cost you your head. That sounds insane, but the fact that kings banned it, that spies risked their lives to steal it, that whole financial empires were born in the rooms where it was served, tells you something. Coffee was never just a beverage. It never was. So how did a wild shrub from the forests of Ethiopia become the second most traded commodity on Earth after oil? How did it topple the habits of empires, bankroll colonies, and quietly power almost every revolution of the modern age? To answer that, you have to travel back more than 1,000 years, to a highland forest where the plant first grew wild and no one yet knew what to do with it. The story everyone tells begins in the 9th century, in the Ethiopian region of Kaffa, which may be where the word coffee comes from. A young goat herder named Kaldi supposedly noticed his goats leaping and prancing through the night after eating bright red berries from a strange shrub. He tried the berries himself, felt a jolt of energy, and carried them to a nearby monastery. Now here is the part most retellings quietly skip. That story was first written down around 1671, more than 800 years after it supposedly happened, by a man in Rome who had never set foot in Ethiopia. Historians treat it as a charming legend, not a fact. What is almost certainly true is older and quieter. The indigenous Oromo people of the region were using the coffee plant long before anyone brewed it, grinding the berries together with fat into dense energy balls they carried on long journeys. Coffee did not begin as a drink at all. It began as food. The berry came first, the cup came much later, and the cup arrived across the Red Sea in Yemen. By the 1400s, Sufi Muslim monks in the Yemeni highlands had discovered that a brew made from roasted coffee beans kept them awake and focused through long nights of prayer and chanting. They called it kahwa. This is the real turning point. For the first time, coffee was not chewed for enshiji, it was roasted, ground and brewed into something close to what we drink today. The Yemeni port of Mocha became the beating heart of the trade, a name still attached to coffee 5 centuries later. And for a while, Yemen held something close to a global monopoly on the only coffee in the world. They guarded it ferociously. Before beans were allowed to leave the country, they were boiled or partly roasted so that no living seed could sprout somewhere else. Coffee was a secret, and the secret was worth a fortune, but a secret guarded that jealously is a secret somebody eventually steals. According to legend, in the 1600s, an Indian Sufi named Baba Budan was returning from his pilgrimage to Mecca when he passed through Mecca and tasted kahwa. Smuggling fertile beans out of Arabia was punishable by death. So he is said to have hidden 7 coffee seeds, 7 because the number is sacred in Islam, hiding them in his beard and carried them home to the hills of southern India. He planted them on a misty slope in the hills of southern India, now named Baba Budangiri in his honour, and those seeds became the foundation of Indian coffee, which still grows in those same hills today. They had a problem: how to break a monopoly defended by death. The solution was 7 seeds and a beard, and it worked. The wall around Yemen's secret had its first crack. Not long after, the Dutch managed to spirit living coffee plants out of the region too, and the centuries-old Arabian monopoly was finished. Coffee was loose in the world, and no single empire would ever fully own it again. Wherever coffee went, it did something no food had ever done. It built a new kind of room. Public coffee houses appeared across the Islamic world in Mecca, Cairo, and Damascus. Places called coөхeehouses, where men gathered to talk, argue, play chess, listen to music and debate politics. They were cheap, and they had almost no social barriers, so for the first time the poor could sit and trade ideas alongside the powerful. That terrified the authorities. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg, caught men drinking coffee near a mosque and decided the gatherings looked suspicious. He convened a council, declared coffee forbidden, shut the coffee houses, and had beans burned in the streets. It is the first recorded attempt to ban coffee in history, and it collapsed almost immediately. The Sultan in Cairo, a coffee drinker himself, overturned the ban within weeks, and Khair Beg was eventually stripped of his post. The lesson would echo for centuries. They had a problem. Conversation bred dissent. The solution was prohibition. It never worked. The most extreme version came in the Ottoman Empire. In 1633, after a great fire tore through Istanbul and discontent boiled over in the coffee houses, Sultan Murad IV banned coffee and tobacco entirely. Legend says he disguised himself as a commoner, prowled the streets of his capital with a 100-pound broadsword, and beheaded anyone he caught drinking it. That gory image is almost certainly exaggerated, the kind of detail that swells with every retelling. But the ban itself was real. The punishments were brutal, and under one later ruler, a second offence reportedly meant being sewn into a leather bag and thrown into the Bosphorus. And still, none of it worked. Coffee was simply too popular and too profitable. Within a few decades, the Ottoman court kept its own official coffee maker, and hundreds of coffee houses operated openly. You cannot ban a habit that an entire civilization has decided it cannot live without. By the early 1600s, European travellers passing through the Ottoman world were tasting coffee and carrying stories home. And when it finally reached Europe, the same suspicion chased it. Some Catholic clergy denounced it as a Muslim drink, a satanic brew that ought to be condemned. According to the story, the question went all the way to Pope Clement VIII, who tasted it, found it delicious, and effectively gave it his blessing. Whether or not every word of that is true, the outcome was not in doubt. Coffee was about to conquer Europe, and here is where it stops being a drink and becomes an engine. The first European coffee houses opened in Venice and then exploded across the continent. England's first opened around 1650, and within a few decades, London alone had hundreds of them. The English nicknamed them penny universities, because for the price of a single cup, 1 penny, you could sit for hours and absorb the sharpest minds in the city arguing science, politics, and trade. Isaac Newton and the scientists of the Royal Society debated in them. Newspapers were pinned to the walls and read aloud. At a shared coffeehouse table, your social rank mattered less than the strength of your argument, and merchants sat elbow to elbow with poets and lawyers. But the coffeehouses did something stranger than spread ideas. They built institutions that still run the world today. At a coffeehouse run by a man named Edward Lloyd, sailors, merchants, and shipowners gathered to swap shipping news and insure one another's voyages. That coffeehouse became Lloyd's of London, today one of the largest insurance markets on the planet. At another, called Jonathan's, traders met to buy and sell shares, and that gathering grew into the London Stock Exchange. Auctions held in coffeehouses matured into the great houses of Sotheby's and Christie's. Think about that. Modern insurance, the modern stock market, the modern auction. The machinery of global capitalism was assembled in rooms that existed to serve cups of coffee. The drink authorities had tried to ban because it made people gather and talk had become the place where the modern economy was invented. And the powerful noticed. In England, coffee houses had become so loud with political talk that in 1675 King Charles II issued a proclamation to suppress them, accusing them of being the resort of idle and disaffected persons who spread false and scandalous reports against his government. The ban was supposed to take effect within days. The public outcry was so furious that the king backed down in under 2 weeks. He had discovered the same truth as the sultans before him. The coffee house could not be closed, because business, news, and daily life now ran straight through it. There had even been pressure from another direction. A year earlier, in 1674, a satirical pamphlet called the Women's Petition Against Coffee had circulated in London, complaining that the drink made husbands useless and kept them gossiping at the coffee house instead of coming home. Mock outrage or not, it captured something real. Coffee had rearranged daily life so completely that people were arguing about it from every side. Nowhere did the coffeehouse turn more dangerous than in France. In Paris, a café called the Procope became a haunt of Enlightenment writers, with Voltaire, Rousseau and Diderot all said to have argued at its marble tables. Ideas about liberty, rights and revolution circulated over coffee in a country still ruled by an absolute king. And then, on the 12th of July 1789, those ideas spilled into the street. When news arrived that the king had dismissed his popular finance minister, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a table outside the Café de Foire in the gardens of the Palais Royal. In the heat of the moment, his lifelong stammer vanished, and he called the crowd to arms, warning them that a royalist massacre was coming. 2 days later, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille. The most famous spark of the French Revolution was struck on a café table. Just as tea had its Boston Harbor on the other side of the Atlantic, coffee had its Palais Royal. The drink of conversation had become the drink of revolution. If you're finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind everyday things every week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. But every elegant cup served in those Paris and London rooms had a shadow standing behind it, because Europe had a problem. Coffee did not grow in England or France or the Netherlands. It grew in the tropics, and for a long time the supply still depended on a world the Europeans did not control. So they decided to take control, and that decision turned coffee from a drink into one of the cruelest systems of forced labour the world has ever seen. It started again with a single plant. The Dutch managed to obtain living coffee and began growing it on their colony of Java, in what is now Indonesia, which is exactly why a cup of coffee is still nicknamed a cup of Java. They sent a coffee plant as a gift to the King of France, where it was kept under glass in the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris. And around 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu obtained a seedling from that very tree and carried it across the Atlantic to the Caribbean island of Martinique. The voyage was brutal. His ship was nearly seized by pirates, hammered by a storm, and left becalmed for days. Water ran so low that de Clieu, by his own account, shared his tiny ration with the seedling to keep it alive. That single plant survived, and within about 50 years it had multiplied into nearly 19 million coffee trees on Martinique alone. A huge share of all the coffee grown across the Caribbean and Latin America descends from that one smuggled seedling. One plant, one desperate voyage, and an entire hemisphere of coffee. Because what that seedling unleashed was catastrophe. As coffee took root across the Caribbean and South America, the European powers built plantations to feed Europe's bottomless thirst, and the Tele powered those plantations with enslaved Africans. The work was relentless. Coffee cherries had to be picked, sorted, pulped and dried by hand under brutal tropical heat, often from before dawn until long after dark. The same ships, the same merchants, the same ports that moved sugar moved coffee, and the same human beings were worked to exhaustion to produce both. And the connection runs deeper and darker than most people realise. Lloyd's, the gentle coffee house that became an insurance empire, grew into one of the foremost insurers of slave ships. The drink of polite conversation in London was financially bound to the chains in the colonies. The cup and the catastrophe were the same story. Nowhere was this clearer than on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western half of the island of Hispaniola, which we now call Haiti. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue was producing roughly half of all the coffee consumed in the entire world, alongside vast quantities of sugar, and it did so through the labour of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people living under conditions so lethal that the population had to be constantly replaced with new arrivals. It was the most profitable colony on earth, and it was a death camp. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rose up. They burned the plantations, coffee and sugar ore alike, and fought a 13-year war against the armies of France, Spain and Britain. By 1804, they had won. Haiti became the first nation in history founded by formerly enslaved people who had freed themselves. Half the world's coffee supply had been grown on that island, and it collapsed in fire and revolution. Coffee did not just witness the age of slavery and revolt, coffee helped it drive it. After Haiti, the centre of the coffee world shifted south to Brazil. A Portuguese officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta had, according to legend, charmed the wife of a French governor into slipping him fertile coffee seeds hidden inside a farewell bouquet, smuggling Brazil's coffee industry into existence around 1727. Whether or not the romance is true, the result was undeniable. Brazil's enormous land, and for decades its own enslaved and then desperately poor labour force let it grow. Coffee on a scale no one had ever seen. By the mid-1800s, Brazil dominated global production, a position it has held for roughly 150 years and holds to this day. Coffee had finally found the country that would define it. But coffee's grip on the tropics was never as secure as the planters believed. Halfway around the world, the British had turned the island of Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, into one of the largest coffee producers on Earth, clearing vast stretches of rainforest for plantations worked by labourers brought from southern India. Then in 1869, orange spots appeared on the leaves of a single estate. It was a fungus coffee leaf rust, and the planters grimly nicknamed it Devastating Emily. It spread through the island's plantations with terrifying speed. Within about 20 years, Ceylon's coffee industry was simply gone, 90% of the coffee land abandoned. The British planters ruined, tore out their dead coffee, and replaced it with a different crop that resisted the blight. That crop was tea. The reason Sri Lanka is famous for Ceylon tea today and not coffee is a fungus that erased an entire industry in 2 decades. A microbe rerouted the drinking habits of the British Empire. That is how fragile the whole thing always was. And then technology changed everything. The Industrial Revolution that had run partly on coffee-fueled workers now transformed coffee itself. Steamships and railroads carried beans from remote highlands to distant ports in a fraction of the old time. Roasting, grinding, and packaging became industrial processes. Around the turn of the 20th century, commercially viable instant coffee was developed, and decaffeinated coffee was invented in Germany, splitting the drink into a dozen new forms. Brewing went from a craft to a convenience. Coffee that had once been guarded as a secret, banned as a threat, and smuggled at the risk of death became something you could scoop from a tin in your own kitchen in seconds. The luxury had quietly become a staple. In the 20th century, coffee wove itself into the rhythm of work itself. The very phrase coffee break entered the language, and in some countries the right to one was eventually written into labour agreements. Soldiers in both world wars were supplied with coffee as a matter of morale. Then came the chains. A single company, growing out of Seattle in the 1980s and the 1990s, took the old idea of the coffee house, the gathering place for talk, and turned it into a global brand on nearly every corner, trailed by an entire culture of lattes, espresso drinks, and paper cups carried down the street. The Yemeni monks who first brewed qahdwa to survive a long night of prayer would not recognise a caramel-iced latte, but they would recognise exactly why people drink it. The reason has never really changed. Today, coffee is grown in more than 70 countries across the tropics and is one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. The world produces somewhere around 170 million 60-kilogram bags of it a year and drinks an estimated 2.25 billion cups every single day. Brazil alone grows roughly a third of it, and Vietnam, which barely produced coffee a few generations ago, surged in the 1990s to become the second largest grower on Earth. And the appetite is still wildly uneven. The country that drinks the most per person is not a producer at all, but Finland, in the cold far north, where the average adult drinks several cups a day and workers have legally protected coffee breaks. The plant that began in an African forest now warms an entire planet. And the modern story is far from settled. A severe drought in Brazil recently pushed coffee prices to record highs, with the benchmark price of Arabica beans more than doubling. And scientists warn that climate change could cut the land suitable for growing the best coffee roughly in half by the middle of this century. Behind the $2 cup stands a fragile chain. Millions of small farmers in the tropics, many of them poor, growing a crop that is increasingly at the mercy of heat, drought, and disease, the same leaf rust that erased Ceylon now creeping into Latin America. The crop that survived bans, oceans, fungus, and revolutions now faces the weather itself. So tomorrow morning, when you pour a cup of something you bought for a few dollars without a second thought, remember what it carries. It carries Sufi monks chanting through the night in the Yemeni highlands, and a mystic smuggling 7 seeds in his beard. It carries a governor burning beans in the streets of Mecca, and a sultan with a broadsword. It carries London traders inventing the stock market and the insurance industry over the same cups, and a young man leaping onto a cafe table in Paris to call a revolution into being. It carries the chains of the Caribbean, the fires of Haiti, and the smuggled seedling that started it all. The drink that men were once beheaded for, that financed empires and helped burn them down, is sitting on your counter right now, steaming, ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Coffee was never just coffee. It never was. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We've got a lot more coming.